They told you Africa was poor. They told you Africa was behind. They told you Africa was waiting to be saved, but no one ever explained why the most powerful nations on Earth refused to leave it alone. No one ever explained why every global crisis eventually circles back to this continent. And no one ever explained why the future of the world is quietly being extracted, negotiated, and fought over in this continent. This is a story from the Fortune Ledger HQ. Africa was never weak. It was made vulnerable, and vulnerability in global politics is not an accident. It is an opportunity. To understand why Africa became the battlefield for global powers, you have to forget the modern map for a moment and rewind to a time before borders were drawn with rulers, before nations were named by foreign tongues, before the world learned to see Africa as a single place instead of thousands of civilizations. Africa was the beginning, not symbolically, literally. Humanity's first footsteps were taken here. Trade routes crossed here long before Europe learned to sail. Gold flowed from West Africa into the Roman Empire. Salt, ivory, copper, and ideas moved across deserts and oceans through African hands. Empires rose and fell on African soil without asking permission from anyone else, and that was the problem. The moment Europe realized that Africa was not empty, not barren, not insignificant, but overflowing with resources, labor, and strategic position, Africa stopped being a neighbor and became a target. The first invasion was not with guns. It was with ships. The transatlantic slave trade did more than steal bodies. It rewired the global economy. Africa became the fuel that powered Europe's rise. Free labor created unimaginable wealth. Sugar, cotton, tobacco, and later industrial expansion were built on African lives. While Europe industrialized, Africa was drained. While capital accumulated in London, Paris, Lisbon, and Amsterdam, Africa bled people, skills, and stability. This was not chaos. It was designed because when you remove millions of productive people from a society, you don't just weaken it economically. You destabilize families, disrupt governance, and fracture trust. Africa did not fall behind because it was incapable. It was pushed back so others could move forward, and when slavery ended, the exploitation didn't. It evolved. The Berlin Conference of 1884 did something unprecedented. European powers sat around a table and divided an entire continent as if it were unoccupied land. No Africans were invited. No cultures were considered. Borders were drawn to serve extraction, not stability. Ethnic groups were split. Rival groups were forced into single political units. Artificial states were created with one purpose: control. This was not nation building. It was resource management. From that moment on, Africa stopped being a collection of civilizations and became a warehouse. Rubber from the Congo, gold from Ghana, diamonds from Sierra Leone, oil from Nigeria, copper from Zambia, and uranium from Niger. Every colony existed to feed an empire elsewhere, and here is where the battlefield truly forms. When the world realized Africa was not just rich, but essential, competition became inevitable. Africa holds over 30% of the world's known mineral reserves. It contains the majority of cobalt, a critical resource for electric vehicles and batteries. It sits on vast oil and gas reserves that power modern economies. Its land feeds global food systems. Its rivers can generate massive energy, and perhaps most importantly, Africa has the youngest population on Earth. Youth is not just demographics. Youth is leverage. A young population means future workers, future consumers, future soldiers, future innovators. While Europe ages, while Asia stabilizes, Africa grows. Whoever influences Africa's systems today shapes the global economy tomorrow. This is why global powers never really left. They just changed uniforms. After independence, Africa was declared free, but freedom without control over capital is theater. Colonial administrators left, but multinational corporations arrived. Loans replaced chains, aid replaced orders, trade agreements replaced direct rule, and the battlefield shifted from visible occupation to invisible dependence. Western powers learned that it was cheaper to influence governments than to govern directly. Support a leader, fund an election, back a coup quietly, install favorable policies, secure extraction rights, keep the currency weak, ensure capital flows outward, not inward. This is why so many African economies export raw materials and import finished goods. Value is added elsewhere. Wealth is captured elsewhere. Africa remains the source, not the beneficiary, and every time an African leader tried to change that equation, the response was swift. Patrice Lumumba spoke of real independence in Congo. He was removed. Thomas Sankara rejected debt dependency in Burkina Faso. He was assassinated. Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency. Libya was destroyed. These were not coincidences. They were warnings because Africa is not just economically important. It is strategically critical. Look at the map. Africa sits between major shipping lanes. The Suez Canal connects Europe to Asia. The Horn of Africa oversees routes linking the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. Whoever controls African ports influences global trade. Whoever controls African airspace and coastlines controls military logistics. This is why foreign military bases are scattered across the continent, not to protect Africa, but to project power. The United States, France, China, Russia, Turkey, the Gulf states. Every major power has a footprint. Some come with soldiers, others with engineers, others with bankers, others with weapons disguised as security assistants, and here is the uncomfortable truth. Africa is not a battlefield because Africans are fighting. Africa is a battlefield because global powers are. Conflicts are rarely spontaneous. They are sustained, fueled, prolonged. Arms flow in, resources flow out. Instability keeps prices low and leverage high. A stable, unified Africa would negotiate differently, and that is the one thing the system cannot allow. So instability becomes policy. Ethnic tensions are amplified. Political rivalries are funded. Religious divisions are exploited. Social media misinformation spreads faster than infrastructure, and every crisis justifies intervention. Humanitarian on the surface, strategic underneath. Then came China. China did not arrive with lectures about democracy. It arrived with roads, ports, railways, and loans. For many African nations, this was a relief. Finally, an alternative. Finally, leverage against Western dominance, but China is not charity, it is strategy. Infrastructure secures influence, debt secures compliance, ports secure trade routes, mining contracts secure future technology supply chains. China understands what the West always understood. Africa is not a problem to solve. It is an asset to secure, and now the battlefield has layers. The United States frames its presence as counterterrorism. France frames it as historical responsibility. China frames it as development. Russia frames it as anti-imperial partnership. Different language, same objective: access, influence, control. Meanwhile, African nations are told to choose sides. Align with the West and risk dependency. Align with China and risk debt. Align with Russia and risk isolation, but the real danger is not alignment. It is fragmentation because divided nations negotiate weakly. Divided regions cannot protect value chains. Divided leadership cannot resist pressure, and the global system knows this. That is why African unity is always discussed but never fully supported. Regional blocs are encouraged only when they pose no threat. The moment cooperation suggests economic independence, pressure increases. Currency dependence is a perfect example. Many African nations do not control their own monetary policy. Some still rely on systems designed decades ago to serve foreign stability, not local growth. Capital flight is normalized, inflation is externalized, debt repayments outpace social spending. This is not mismanagement, it is architecture. And then there is the narrative that Africa is always shown as a place of crisis. Never context, never causality. Wars appear without history. Poverty appears without explanation. Corruption appears without external enablers, Because if people understood why Africa struggles, they would ask uncomfortable questions about who benefits, and the answer is never neutral. Global powers do not fight in Africa because Africa is weak. They fight because Africa is valuable. The oil that fuels economies, the minerals that power technology, the land that feeds billions, the youth that will define the future workforce. This is not about charity. It is about survival. As the world faces climate change, resource scarcity, and demographic decline, Africa becomes the last frontier, the last growth engine, the last uncontested opportunity, and this is why the battle is intensifying. Digital infrastructure is now contested. Data is the new resource. Fintech, mobile money, and digital identity systems are becoming tools of influence. Whoever controls payment rails controls economies. Whoever controls data shapes behavior. The battlefield has moved from land to systems, and Africa is once again at the center, but here is the part that changes everything. Africa is no longer unaware. A new generation is watching, questioning, and building. Africans are no longer just subjects of global power games. They are learning the rules, challenging contracts, building local value chains, creating regional trade agreements, investing in technology. The battlefield is still here, but the players are changing because the greatest threat to global control is not war. It is independence. Not symbolic independence, but economic independence. Control over resources, control over currency, control over data, control over narrative. The story of Africa is still being written, not as a finished chapter, not as a resolved struggle, but as a process still unfolding in real time, because before any final outcome can be claimed, the mechanisms beneath the surface must be exposed. The financial systems that quietly dictate policy, the currencies that never truly belong to the nations using them, the debts that outlive presidents, the wars that never officially begin yet never seem to end. Africa did not become a battlefield overnight. It was engineered layer by layer, agreement by agreement, crisis by crisis, and to understand how deep the control runs, you have to move beyond history and into the machinery that still operates today. Control rarely announces itself. It embeds. It normalizes. It hides inside systems that look technical, neutral, and unavoidable, and nowhere is this more visible than in money. After independence, African nations were told the hard part was over. Flags were raised, anthems were written, presidents took office, but beneath the symbolism, the economic wiring remained intact. The same export routes, the same trade dependencies, the same financial institutions setting the rules. Money became the new chain. Most African states entered independence with no real capital base. Centuries of extraction had ensured that wealth sat elsewhere. So when new governments needed funding for schools, hospitals, roads, and defense, they did what seemed rational. They borrowed. Loans came with conditions, not always obvious, not always written in plain language, but every condition narrowed autonomy, currency devaluation, spending limits, privatization, trade liberalization, open markets for foreign firms, closed protection for local industry. Debt was framed as assistance, but debt is leveraged because a nation that owes must comply. Budgets are no longer moral documents. They are repayment schedules. Social services compete with interest payments. Long-term development loses to short-term liquidity, and every election is haunted by creditors watching closely. Some countries never escape this loop. They refinanced old debt with new debt, paid interest without touching principal. Decades passed, generations changed, the debt remained, and then there were the currencies. Several African nations do not issue money, they fully control. Monetary policy is constrained by external guarantees designed for stability elsewhere. Inflation targets serve foreign confidence, not local growth. Capital can leave faster than it enters. When crises hit, adjustment is demanded internally, never externally. This is why economic shocks in Africa hurt deeper and recover slower. The tools used by wealthy nations to stabilize themselves are often unavailable here, but finance alone does not secure dominance. Instability does because a stable country can renegotiate contracts. A peaceful region can build industries. A unified population can demand accountability. So stability becomes conditional. Conflicts erupt along familiar fault lines. Ethnicity, religion, borders drawn without consent, but these tensions are rarely spontaneous. They are activated, armed, and sustained. Weapons do not manufacture themselves. Money does not move accidentally. Civil wars become marketplaces. Minerals fund militias, oil finances factions. Timber, diamonds, and gold are exchanged for guns. External actors condemn violence publicly while benefiting privately from discounted access, and when violence persists long enough, it becomes justification. Peacekeeping missions arrive. Military partnerships deepen. Security contracts expand. Foreign bases become permanent. Surveillance infrastructure grows. Intelligence sharing flows outward faster than protection flows inward. Africa becomes securitized not because it is uniquely violent, but because violence makes control easier. Then comes the modern layer, technology. Mobile money revolutionized African economies. Millions gained access to finance for the first time. Transactions became digital. Data became valuable. Payment rails became power. Whoever controls financial infrastructure controls economic behavior. Fees shape markets. Access shapes opportunity. Data predicts consumption, and systems built quickly are rarely owned locally. Telecommunications networks, cloud storage, digital identity, undersea cables, satellites. These are not neutral investments. They are strategic assets. As Africa digitizes, the battlefield expands into algorithms and databases. Influence no longer requires soldiers. It requires platforms. It requires standards. It requires ownership of the invisible layers people depend on daily. Meanwhile, climate pressure tightens the grip. Arable land shrinks. Water becomes contested. Migration increases. Food systems strain. Countries least responsible for emissions absorb the heaviest costs, and crises create openings. Emergency financing, emergency intervention, emergency governance. Every emergency shifts power upward and outward. Yet, something is changing. African states are negotiating harder. Regional trade agreements are forming. Local manufacturing is returning in pockets. Youth populations are politically louder. Information moves faster than propaganda. The battlefield is still here, but it is no longer uncontested. Global powers sense this. Competition intensifies, offers become sweeter, pressure becomes subtler, influence becomes multi-layered because the stakes are rising. Whoever shapes Africa's systems today does not just control resources. They shape the rules of the next global order, and that is why the struggle deepens. Not with declarations, but with contracts, with code, with credit. Quietly, relentlessly. The war for Africa was never about land alone. It was about who decides the future, and that decision is still being fought for.